Everybody, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Angel Shu, and I'm an assistant professor of public policy and the environment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I also am the founder and director of a research group called the Data-Driven Enviro Lab. And it's my distinct pleasure to be moderating and hosting today's conversation, creating climate transparency through innovative digital technologies. We have an amazing panel today representing diverse perspectives from the startup nonprofit world, also from the government and also intergovernmental perspective. And just to kick off our conversation today, the world of climate data as we know it is incredibly fragmented. It's incredibly heterogeneous. You have companies and governments and individuals that are reporting and climate change data on their emissions, on their activities on climate change action, and how they're working to decarbonize their operations and supply chains. And so it's become incredibly diverse and spread out and fragmented all across the world. But as we know, with the 2015 Paris Agreement, we have a clear goal. We have to have global emissions by 2030, and we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050 if we want to keep this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal alive. And in order to do that, the entire Paris Agreement really rests on this idea of transparency and data in order to hold actors accountable, because it's not necessarily legally binding. It doesn't have that same top-down structure that we've seen in other climate agreements like the Kyoto Protocol. So it's critical that actors that are participating and taking actions on climate change coordinate together in order to generate the kinds of transparency and subsequently the accountability that we need to ensure that everyone is following through and meeting their goals to help us achieve the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree target. And so with that brief introduction, I'd like to just give you a sense of what we're going to do today during this panel. We have 5 amazing speakers, as I just mentioned, representing different perspectives on this theme of creating climate transparency through next generation innovative digital technologies, from blockchain to the use of satellite remote sensing, sensors, etc. So we'll let them take about 5 minutes each to just introduce themselves and their work and their perspectives. And then I have a couple of questions to just start a panel conversation. And then for those folks who are joining in the audience, we would love your questions and your comments. So please use the chat, and my colleague Marco Schletz from Data Driven Lab will also be monitoring the chat. And so I'll try to then turn over to you to ask a couple of questions. I'll just read them out loud in the interest of time. So without further ado, I'd like to first introduce Chandra, Sikar, Sinha, who's part of the World Bank Climate Change Group. And so Chandra, if you could kick us off by giving us the national government perspective and specifically talking about how the World Bank Climate Warehouse is trying to bring together and connect disparate climate accounting schemes from carbon pricing and carbon market programs around the world. So Sandra?
Thank you, Angel. And it's a pleasure to be joining you in this session of the Innovate for Climate. Angel, you set the stage pretty well by indicating very clearly that we are in a different regulatory regime as far as climate change is concerned. The Kyoto Protocol was much more of a top-down approach, and the Paris Agreement visualizes or envisages action from not just state actors, but non-state actors and a whole range of non-state actors as well. And the Climate Warehouse, I'll focus on the Climate Warehouse as an example of a bottom-up architecture of the Paris Agreement and the implication it has, and the way in which at least we at the World Bank envisage the use of digital technologies from the point of view of addressing the transparency, trackability point of view, right? So in the Kyoto Protocol, you had a top-down approach where the UNFCCC Secretariat managed the international transaction log and the CDM registry for carbon market transactions. And the whole model was, if you will, a spoke and wheel kind of a framework where the international transaction log served as a point for validating transactions. And then in the case of the Paris Agreement, where you expect countries to have their own carbon markets to connect to the global carbon markets, you expect independent standards such as gold standard, Vera, or other standards to also be able to create credibility in the carbon market. The challenge is how do you bring together the peer-to-peer networks that involve independent standards, that involve sovereign registries, that involve non-state players or actors from a perspective of transparency. And so the climate warehouse that is envisaged to be a data layer, a metadata layer, which connects the registries that are part of the carbon market, and certainly sovereign and non-sovereign actors participate through these registries. There are transaction layer, which consists of the exchanges or other forms by which carbon market transactions take place. And there's a whole host of services that are provided to the carbon market by the private sector, by civil society, by other players. And the idea of the climate warehouse is to be the single point of data from all of the connected registries, all the standards and sovereigns, so that it is possible for the carbon market transactions or issuances, transactions, trades, cancellations, all to be reflected in this data layer. And in order to ensure immutability, trackability, auditability, we've chosen to build the climate warehouse on a blockchain platform. And we've gone through the process of testing, prototyping, testing, and simulating how the climate warehouse would work over the last 3 years on a range of different platforms, from Ethereum to Kaleido as a blockchain service, to the use of the Chia network at this point, to ensure that this global public data layer is interoperable, it is accessible, it has lowest amount of environmental footprint, all of the things that are necessary for the platform to have the credibility and allow the greatest level of participation. And then the hope is that this permits us to kind of participate in the regulatory framework by providing data through the user interfaces to the global public data layer in a manner that meets the requirement of the market participants. It meets the requirement of the regulators, and we'll come back to the idea of a stock take and how it can facilitate that process. It meets the requirement of sovereign parties to the Paris Agreement to fulfill their reporting requirement under certainly Article 6, and perhaps even under Article 4 or Article 9, those of you who are familiar with the structure of the Paris Agreement. So the goal is for us to utilize the technologies that have been developed since the time the international transaction log was set up in the late 90s, and utilize digital platforms, link it to sensor technology, link it to remote sensing, to create a ecosystem which utilizes all the power of the digital development for the credibility of the carbon market. So let me stop here, Angel, and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Chandra. That was perfect timing and really exciting to hear about all the innovations that the World Bank is taking in order to solve a real problem, which is how to link together all of these disparate schemes. Because as we know, in COP26, Article 6 was decided. And so now there's going to be transference of carbon credits across many borders, and we have to find some way to link it together. So I think it was really exciting to hear about how you're thinking about addressing this problem through innovation and digital tech. Okay, and next we have Nancy Norris, who is Director of Strategy of the British Columbia Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. And so Nancy will be talking about a particular pilot in the mining sector of BC. So Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Angel, and thanks for having me today. This is a really exciting session to be a part of. Yeah, so I will let you know a little bit about this pilot project that my ministry is working on. So we're the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. So we oversee the activities of various different industries within BC. So mining is one of them. And we, at the same time, BC has been working on advancements in digital technology and digital identity for individuals. So we have access to this work that's been going on in another part of our government using verified credentials as digital identifiers for individuals and citizens within the province. And what we wanted to do is test out whether or not that technology could be of use in the mining sector to prove provenance of materials and to prove out other sustainability attributes of various mines in the province. So that took us down a bit of a road of supply chain tracing, but we realized very quickly that that is an incredibly complex process, and it's also something that's being worked out in the private sector quite extensively. So then we pivoted our work to a number of other different test cases. And one of them is looking at carbon accounting and how this technology, this use of technology could be a way that government could issue proven and regulated information about the carbon emissions of various mines in the province, and issue it to them almost as like a piece of identity, like similar to a driver's license or something, a passport. And they would have a digital wallet, and then they would be able to pass that information along to platforms that do global carbon accounting. We're also testing out whether or not it could be used within the national inventory. So we would be doing work with the federal government on that. And the sort of the nexus of this for us is that BC has fairly strong climate legislation. We have a carbon tax, and we also have a program where we collect information on the emissions of large industrial emitters within the province. And depending on activities that they undertake to reduce their emissions, they can get a lowered amount of carbon tax or a rebate on their carbon tax. So this is really to encourage good behavior and reduction of emissions over time. And being able to use digital technology to sort of harness the data that we collect and being able to offer it back to mines within this particular pilot, and have it for them in a digital format, which is credible and trusted, and for them to be able to pass that information along. We see it as a government as like a way of empowering businesses within the province. So we've been working with Martin and his team at Open Earth. We did a pilot that was demonstrated at COP last year, and that was government issued data being issued to the mine, and then the mine being able to have that data verified by the Open Earth's portal for climate emissions data, which is called the Open Climate portal. And this year, what we're planning to do is to have another layer of rigor to the data. We're working with an auditor. So in BC, large emitters submit their emissions, they self-report, and that information is verified by an auditor. So we are testing and we're piloting having the auditor actually as the issuer of the digital credential to the mine. And then that mine would be able to pass that information along in the same sort of trusted manner using verified credential technology.
Thank
so
you
that's
so much.
That's an overview of our work. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks so much, Nancy. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
But yeah, I mean, it's so great to hear that BC is leading again. I think whenever I teach my climate change class, we always talk about British Columbia as being one of the first state level and province level governments that has adopted a carbon tax and the innovative ways that you reinvest the revenue generated back into low carbon programs. And so it's really great to hear that you're also pushing the boundaries even further through this mining project and the verified digital credentials. And I know Martine will be speaking about that in more detail in a bit, but first I want to turn to Lekha Estradar from Climate Trace. Lekha is a senior policy analyst, and this is a really interesting project that I've gotten to know over the course of last year and working with Lekha and her colleagues. So Lekha, please tell us more about Climate Trace.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Angel. Let me start with a quick intro to Climate Trace. We are a not-for-profit coalition of organizations that include nonprofits, tech companies, and academia, with the collective goal of bringing radical transparency to global emissions monitoring. Transparency, that is to say, where emissions are coming from, when, and how much, is central to successful climate action, both to hold actors accountable to the pledges they make, as Angel already pointed out, and also to help them set sufficiently ambitious targets. Several countries, multinational companies, and non-state actors have committed to net zero targets, but measuring action against all of these pledges require much better data than the current state of the art. In fact, if you look at even at the country level, there are over 100 countries that don't have official emissions inventories after 2015. And that gap widens among non-state actors. So, and that's because it's expensive and resource intensive to measure emissions. One recent development, though, has been the proliferation of lower cost satellites in orbit studying our planet. And that's likely to be a game changer. At present, the use of satellites to study climate risk or to measure atmospheric greenhouse gases at the global level are well understood. But this is just a beginning. There is so much more data that's being collected by satellites, imagery, thermal data, and other data points that are not necessarily being used for measuring climate or emissions, but could definitely be used for that purpose, especially when coupled with artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. So that's pretty much what we're doing at Climate Trace in collaboration with several other contributors and partner organizations, including some people I see on this in this meeting. So at a really high level, what we do is we use satellite observations of emissions activities, like the plumes coming out of a power plant stack, or the movement of a ship from point A to point B. And we combine this with ground-based sensor data or other ground truth data in machine learning or statistical models to estimate the activity occurring at a particular location. And we then combine this with other information like the capacity of the facility, the technology that's being used, or the fuel that's being used to then estimate emissions. Our central theory of change is that access to granular and up-to-date information can accelerate climate action because granular data is actionable. We've spoken to multiple stakeholders across different industries like corporate sustainability teams, financial institutions, and subnational governments. And all of them have different data needs and different granularities, but the consensus is that better data, especially for some of the hard to track sectors like landfills or livestock, methane producing sectors, could significantly improve the state of the art. And the other kind of big requirement has also been facility level emissions, which is why at the end of 2022, we'll be releasing our first facility level emissions data set across different sectors. And going forward, our goal is to keep iterating on our models, both to improve accuracy and also to keep including other facilities within our database. One thing to note, however, is that our work does not rely on satellite data alone, because while satellite data is fantastic in that it's universally and globally available, it may not provide sufficient insight unless it is coupled with ground truth data. And currently there are so many companies and organizations and governments that have incredibly valuable data sets that are, again, not necessarily being used for emissions monitoring, but could definitely be used as indicators of emissions. So, this is also a call for people, if they want to collaborate with us and provide access to these data sets, please get in touch. And I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Angel.
Thank you so much, Leica. And yeah, I think one of the most innovative parts about the Climate Trace Coalition is the fact that you have been able to convene so many different organizations and people to work together and to donate their time in the, I guess, the brand of radical transparency. So it's really great to hear that also at the end of 2022, you'll be releasing this facility level data set. So I'm going to be first in line to get that data. So you can definitely count on me to be your first user. Okay, and last but not least, I would like to introduce Martin Weinstein, who is the Chief Executive of the Open Earth Foundation. And Martin will be talking about the open climate architecture that Nancy mentioned earlier. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Angel. What a pleasure to join so many collaborators in this exciting and very important topic as we kick off at the beginning of the role of transparency in the broader Paris Agreement and how technologies can play an important role there. The Open Earth Foundation works in the intersection of emerging digital technologies, so we're constantly doing research, innovation, and deployment with a lot of focus on distributed ledgers because of the role in trust and automation, but also IoT and AI, and fundamentally on how to think about open digital infrastructure and the role of open source and the role of collaboration between stakeholders to convene on defining and testing open digital infrastructure for, to some extent, augmenting our capacity as humanity to deal with the Earth system. And we use Earth system science and systems thinking to apply this at the planetary scale. And that take us to climate accounting as one of the fundamental, for us, leverage points, an area where it's key for us to improve. And that's why a lot of this sort of ends up convening, and so many of us in the field end up connecting and working together. Because in some sense, we're going to have to do robust and rigorous accounting for the next decades, if not century. So it makes sense for us to get really good at that. Our work has been based on initially a framework called the Open Climate Framework and a vision for an integrated climate accounting system. And the framework and then the Open Climate Project itself in a portal combines consensus on the state of the Earth system and so many things that we do, such as pricing carbon or stock taking process, ideally should be integrated into the current state of the atmosphere, and having a clear status of how many parts per million, what's been the temperature increase, and understanding of insight pathways. The second part is world actor registries, and we've talked about some of them, and this involves, of course, the national registries, which are the inventories, the subnationals, the cities, as well as the market registries, which Chandra was alluding to, and the importance of being able to link them in some sense. And within that aspect is why we've been pushing for thinking, designing, and deploying architectures around nested accounting, jurisdictional nesting. The third aspect of the framework involves the role of MRV, and monitoring, reporting, and verifying, whether we're talking about emissions, mitigations, or adaptation actions. How do we create trust in the data to back up that action and the claims in the action and in those actions? And then the fourth one is on markets, the ability that if we assetize the data of those actions, that could be traded between different actors. And sometimes not necessarily traded, but just purely accounted to the right actor. And finally, finance, which is a very important part that led us to the focus on accounting and the focus on emerging tech, because when we trust our accounting, we can automate things around payments. And we do that every time we submit our taxes. And that is, I think, a very important tool for us to do this at scale. So with the Open Climate Framework in mind, we've been working on the different technological tools and designs to be able to think of it in the context of the Paris Agreement, but that also involves all non-state actors, which are not always directly part of the Paris Agreement because it's purely through the national level. Now, before maybe I give it back to you, Angel, with that introduction of our work at Open Earth and the Open Climate, as I was listening to everyone present and thinking about transparency and some of the important technological breakthroughs we've had, I see that we could break down transparency into maybe three key buckets. One is insight. I need to know what I need to convey for me to be transparent about it, right? So if I might not be transparent if I don't know exactly what my footprint is, and me being a company or a government. The second part is trust, right? I may know what my footprint is or what my mitigations are as a company, government, but I might not want to share everything. I might not want to be fully transparent, and I might have good reasons for that as a business, for example. I may also have not good reasons. For example, I want to fudge the data, which is something that happens often. So how do we address that from a transparency? And third, visibility. Visibility, meaning that if everyone's transparent, but you don't have a way of bringing it together, it doesn't become as transparent. And it's the same thing when you look at a contract. I always say, like, the fine print doesn't necessarily mean it's transparent, because you really have to sit down and read it. So if it's hard to find, then it might not be as transparent. And with these three buckets, there have been very important technological tools. Insight, we've talked about IoT and satellite, machine learning, all these improve our level of insight, of us actually knowing what our emissions and mitigations are. In trust, this is where cryptography has made the biggest amount of progress. When Nancy was introducing verifiable credentials, one thing that's embedded into decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials is something called zero knowledge proof. Something where you can trust what I'm saying without me giving access to the raw data set. So if I'm a business and I have certain data sets that are sensitive for my business performance, but the aggregate information from that data set is relevant for my climate disclosure, I may want to be able to say, trust my disclosure, and you might use mathematical tools to verify that I'm not tampering with that. So blockchain is creating some very interesting opportunities in the trust layer. And finally, visibility. Chandra was discussing around how to bring a lot of this disparate data together into a common pool, so that we're able to monitor something that Angel pointed out very important. What happens when these units start moving across borders? It's very important that we have visibility. And that actually helps demystify one thing. Using a blockchain doesn't necessarily solve a double counting problem. If you've got 100 different blockchains, you've got 100 different record keeping systems. So the visibility of those becomes very important. So hopefully that inspired by just listening to all of you, that framework helps us navigate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Martine. And my mind just exploded when you said 100 different blockchains. And I really liked your articulation of these three types of transparency, particularly the third point. I think you're absolutely right. The day and age that we're living in, we're just constantly flooded with new data, more information. And I was attending a transparency conference last week, and somebody mentioned this word that I had just learned, which is infobesity. So we're living in this age of gluttony of data, and it's really hard then, having too much transparency in some sense, to then be able to seek that signal through the noise. So thanks so much to all of our panelists for also staying incredibly on time. And I just have a couple of questions I'd like to open our panel discussion with. And so the first question is to Leica and Nancy. And I'm going to go a little bit off script from what Marco had prepared. So I hope you're okay going along with me. But it struck me as when both of you were speaking that there's a critical question about data adoption. And I think, Nancy, in your case, it's been really interesting. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how you convinced the local minds and your local stakeholders to actually come on this journey with you to use these digital identifiers and to examine the application of blockchain technology. It seems that you have been talking a lot about incentives. So I think that would be really great if you could just shed more light on how you managed to get people on board. And then I think also same thing with Leica. I think there's always the feeling, and I also wrestle with this challenge a lot, which is when you go and you do research and you're designing this great data set, you're collecting all this information, you think, wow, this is going to be so great. This is going to change the climate space. But then it's not that if you just provide the data or you build it, they will come. And so how have you, as the Climate Trace Coalition, thought about actually getting the data into the hands of people that can really use it? So I'll start first with Nancy.
Sure, yeah, happy to speak to that. So we are in the second year of this pilot, and you've touched on something that has been so critical, which is onboarding and adoption. So for the first year, we had all of the folks who were first movers and very excited about and sort of courageous about adopting the technology. And now we're moving into a space where we have multiple different actors in each of the use cases that we're developing. Some of them are way more excited and gung-ho about the technology side. Others are very reticent about it and don't have any background in it at all. And then there's a whole governance component as well. So some of these use cases have very pre-existing governance for how the credential would be created and how it would be exchanged, because that process already exists in the non-digital world. So it's very easy for us to just point to those governance documents. But others, we're really creating it from scratch. It doesn't exist yet. So we actually redesigned the delivery format for the project. We now have the technical team, and then we have an onboarding and adoption team, like the pilot team. And on that onboarding and adoption team, we have a technical developer who specializes in helping use case participants get technically ready. We're creating we're working in open source technology, so it's all available, but having a non-technical small mine in BC it doesn't have an IT team, like they outsource all their email and everything, so having them, saying to them, okay, well, can you stand up your own instance of this digital wallet? There's no way. So they need someone from our team to help them with that. We also have a business analyst and a change management specialist to look at their business processes and analyze where those might be impacted or might need to be changed somewhat. And we have a communications specialist on board now as well to help explain, because it is incredibly complex, and it's intuitive in that we're mapping processes in many cases that already exist, and we're just using a new technology to improve on those processes. But that's easy to say, and then the deeper dive is way more complicated, and depending on how sophisticated the actor is within the use case, they need different levels of communication. They need the 1,000 feet, and then some of them want to go right down into the technical architecture of how things are being built. So having someone on our team who can react and can provide that information to various different folks is critical for broader adoption.
Yeah, I really appreciate those thoughts, Nancy. I think I picked up on two key points that you made. I think one is the interlinking to existing governance structures. I think that's really critical. So it's not reinventing the entire wheel. I think that seemed to really stand out to me in what you said. And then I think the second piece was the having somebody to actually be the interface and helping to build the capacity. And so we've been hearing that a lot in our own work, that when you're introducing new tools and new digital technologies, that's a critical piece that I think often the technologists overlook, is the fact that there's a lot. I mean, I think everyone threw out, as Chandra, starting from Chandra, threw out a lot of terms that if you're not already immersed in the digital technology space, interoperability and zero knowledge proofs and blockchain and digital trust identifiers. I mean, this is a lot of vocabulary for somebody to take on. So I think that was a critical piece that I also heard you saying. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. So Lekha.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Angel. Yeah, absolutely. Like with anything, you're absolutely right that if you build it, they will come is definitely not true, especially in the climate space. I mean, first of all, we're looking at a small pool of people who actually need climate, granular emissions data, and then among those who need it, there's a smaller group who actually want it, because there's going to be a number of them who need it, but they probably don't want to use the more granular data for whatever reasons. And even among those who actually need it and want it, there are going to be, users who have other constraints. But, even if they had fantastic emissions data, they might have financial or other constraints which actually prevent them from actually using the data. And then finally, even if they met all of these considerations, climate trees might not have the exact data that they wanted, or any other organization in the space might not be able to fulfill their exact data needs. So we were very kind of cognizant of these issues when we kind of entered the space. So we've spent a lot of time speaking to potential users to really understand, do you have the data you need? And, if no, what data would, do you need that would help you reduce emissions? And if you had that data, how would you go about reducing emissions? These seem surprisingly simple questions, but they've really provoked a lot of thinking among the organizations we've spoken to, and they've definitely contributed to our kind of prioritizing of what data features we wanted to kind of we've had to prioritize as well. So, for example, a facility level data set was a clear example of the kind of data set that financial institutions said they would find incredibly helpful, because we currently have country level emissions, and they were like, that's great, but that's not how we make decisions. So that's been something that we've prioritized. Another data feature that's increasingly come up in a lot of conversations we've had is it's like a satellite can see a power plant, but it can't tell you who owns the power plant, for example. So connecting emissions to business owners, which is a separate project in itself, that's increasingly emerging as something that a lot of potential users are asking for. So so it's a mix of finding the users who actually are able to use this data right now, and also meeting them halfway by prioritizing the data features that they would actually find useful is kind of how we're going about it. But also there's an increasing recognition in the space that data is coming, and a lot of transparency is coming in the space, and a lot of organizations just want to get ahead of that curve and kind of be leaders rather than kind of be led, kicking and screaming. So that's been a positive development.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lekha. I think the point that you made about co-creation being absolutely critical to just making sure that if you're the data provider or the digital technologist, that you're not designing something that won't fit user end needs. But then I think at the same time, you can't design for every single scenario, and you can't satisfy every single user or audience with one tool. And so I think that's always a tension and trade-off. So we're getting some great questions from the audience, but I do have one question that I want to pose to Chandra and also to Martine before we turn to the audience. So as many of you know, right now we are in a critical period with respect to the Paris Agreement. Next year, and actually already starting now, parties are submitting information, and the UN Climate Change Secretariat is working towards the first global stocktake. So the Paris Agreement has these 5-year check-in periods to make sure that parties are on track to meeting their goals. They're going to be looking at the data, the actions, and making sure that everything lines up. So I was wondering if both you, Chandra and Martine, could speak to how you see your particular projects helping to support this global stocktake process. So I'll start first with Chandra and then turn to Martine.
Thanks, Angel. I think the global stocktake in the Paris Agreement has a critical role in terms of defining the ambition in the scale up or scaling up the ambitions of the NDCs, and the design of the underlying infrastructure of the climate warehouse is intended to provide information to the participating countries by aggregating information from different sources, which facilitates their understanding of the kind of climate action that is being implemented on the ground. And the goal of it may evolve over time, because the carbon markets are just beginning to take off. Certainly, there are a lot of voluntary market activity now, and in the future, I think, as compliance markets pick up as well, the role of carbon markets may become much more significant, and the role of the infrastructure like the climate warehouse, which allows the user interface to be designed in a way to meet reporting requirements under Article 6, under Article 4, and Article 9, as I indicated, all of which will contribute to the global stocktake, I think is going to become even more central. I do think, integrating it to the climate trace kind of an approach of getting data from aggregated sources, satellite-based data, which allows further verification and adding to the trust component, as Martin was indicating, and linking it perhaps with the climate warehouse type of information is something that is one concrete follow-up that may come from this panel. And I intend to reach out to Lekha as a follow-up to this in trying to understand how the information that is available, particularly I understand on methane emissions, for example, and linking it to the climate warehouse and providing that information in a more digestible and easily understood platform, I think would be the approach that we take. But again, to contribute to the multilateral process of a global stock take, I think that's the approach that we envisage and we visualized when we were setting up the architecture of the climate warehouse itself. So certainly important part of the outcome that the climate warehouse intends to deliver on in terms of the global stock take. I must also bring to attention another initiative that we have where we need to understand better linkages is the climate transparency initiative, Angel, which is not directly something that we've talked about here, but I wanted to draw the attention of the audience to, which is to look at the NDCs of countries, sovereigns, and look at the progress with implementation of NDC from an independent assessment point of view through a consortium of think tanks and civil society organizations, which the World Bank initiated with a number of other partners about 6 years ago, which is provides the update on G20 progress, the progress of the G20 countries in the implementation of the NDCs, and trying to understand how these emerging technologies and platforms can be utilized by that kind of initiative, non-government, non-state actor-based contribution to the global stock take, I think, is another important angle that I think we should consider going forward. So with that, back to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Chandra. And Martin?
Yeah, great point, because it really makes why the Paris Agreement is, while being quite encompassing, still the best tool that we have to address climate change. At the top level, it is anchored in staying below 2 degrees with efforts below 1.5. But at the same time, the Paris Agreement is structured in relation to parties and countries. So what we've been discussing in terms of transparency and being able to bring in accounting for different actors is perhaps what can help us move from just tracking the climate process through countries to understanding how we can all be part of the Paris Agreement. And this is where a lot of our work has included the vision for an exercise of an independent global stocktake and something that can be digitally enabled. That to me is one of the most important linkages we can do. We perhaps helps us transcend falling into a situation where we sort of sit back as individuals and expect the countries to do all the work, when the reality is that's not how it works in real life. Companies, individuals, cities play a very important role, subnational governments, and we're all jurisdictionally nested into some form of space. It ends up in a country. But even if we don't necessarily associate to a country specifically, and I find myself falling into that category as an Earth citizen, that still ends up being into the Earth level. So my relationship with my efforts on climate change will move from where I'm standing in my house in Los Angeles, in California, in the United States, in Earth. And so that level of accounting at the top level is one of the key things that we'd love to be able to collectively design. The accounting infrastructure, as we call it, a climate intranet, where we're all networked together, and we organize that in a specific way, so that when we do these stock taking processes, which will form the heartbeat of the Paris Agreement, of like, this is what you said you were going to do, this is where you're at, this is where you should be in some sense to meet that 1.5 degree target, and here are the opportunities to bridge that gap. that narrative doesn't just fall in the land of countries, but everyone that are in the constituency of countries. So the challenge for us is to be able to put that system together so that over the next 35 years in our road to net zero, but then also net negative emissions to 2100, we have a situation where we all work together towards that mission. So the Paris Agreement doesn't have that infrastructure in place, but it has a lot of the hints to it. And so I think that's one of the key parts where that as soon as we start opening the space of climate to everyone, the level of transparency and trust becomes more rigorous, the level of insight, and the level of cost reduction for everyone to participate in that rigor is essential. So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is emerging digital technologies. One of the promises that we need to ask from them, because at the end of the day, they're just tools. They're not silver bullets. Perhaps the most important technologies we have are our social innovations, our ability to collaborate, our ability to design mechanisms that are win-win scenarios for everyone. But one of the things we ask for the digital technologies to reduce the cost of putting together that robustness. And it's very relevant as we think about the global south, as is often framed in the Paris Agreement, and the ability to have companies, individuals, and cities in the global south being able to have clear, robust accounting of their emissions, but also of their mitigations, and how all of these can be reconciled at the global level, and how this eventually unleashes a lot of economic opportunity. People on the ground creating mitigation outcomes that are facilitating others that are having a harder time producing those mitigation outcomes. And that's also, of course, where Chandra's comments come in, the ability for doing automated cross-border adjustments, leveraging integrated market layer. So I'll pause there, but I do want to sort of share that passion for how important the Paris Agreement is and how important is our role to be able to innovate on top of it.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, Martine. I think also part of the challenge, in addition to the opportunities that you laid out, is the fact that transparency is so much more multifaceted and complicated in the context of the Paris Agreement, with the various constellations and ecosystems of actors, and the potential for technologies to really accelerate the kinds of transparency that we need in order to achieve our goals. So I've been told we have a very hard stop in 3 minutes at 1 p.m. And so I don't think we have time to do another pass around to our panelists. And so I'll just highlight one of the questions that just came up from Philip, because actually Chandra and Martine did a great job in answering some questions. Oh, and Marco just answered this one, but just I think, yeah, this is something that Chandra had brought up about the use of blockchain technology. So Philip is asking, is blockchain a present or a future component of verification, accounting, and even trading of carbon offsets, either now and the future? Is it a positive contributor? And I think that's pointing to the fact that there's been a lot of criticism and questioning of blockchain as being a high energy consuming technology. So does any of our panelists want to just take a quick crack at that with the 2 minutes that we have left?
I mean, I'll start with the energy intensity part, which I think it's very important and often requires understanding where that comes from. So the first blockchain, as we know it, Bitcoin network, uses a consensus protocol proof of work, and it's highly energy consuming. And essentially, when the proof of work, what it means is proof of energy consumption in some sense, because you're using electricity to run a mathematical equation to solve a puzzle. And Ethereum, the second most important, largest blockchain, also built on that. It's not as highly consuming as Bitcoin, but still extremely consuming. They also have a plateau design, so they don't necessarily have to consume over to infinity. That's what creates a little bit of the scarcity, which is why the miners are called miners, because of the scarcity of it. But those are one type of blockchains. And I know that some people in climate accounting space have used Bitcoin protocol for something, but it's normally not what is being used for. Ethereum, yes, but there's also layer 2s, which do not derive the need for that computational power for all that trust. So you can have another blockchain on top of that, which is a lot more energy efficient. And then there's also other different protocols. So the point here is, it's been now 5 years since blockchains have been in mainstream, 2017. And there's been a lot of innovation and evolution. So we are seeing a lot of important shortcomings in the initial versions of the technology, but it's changing. And I think that's a very important part to consider. And for everyone working on the climate space, it's very relevant to know these nuances so that we always select the type of networks that have the ability to scale and the ability to operate what we want them to operate for at a lowest carbon intensity. And then other than that, digital systems do consume energy by default. Cloud, this conversation requires some form of electricity power, but that's also why decarbonizing the whole IT space is key and relatively doable because of where data servers can sit and the ability to move around. I'll pause there, but I think it's relevant to put that out.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thanks to Marco and Chandra also for filling in the chat and also sharing your perspectives on that particular point. Well, we are at time. So thanks again so much to our amazing panelists and to all of you for joining in this very rich discussion on how we can create climate transparency through innovative digital technology. So thanks so much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.